Okay. Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to trying to unveil financial integrity. This is hopefully going to be a conversation. We want it to be two ways. We don't want it to be a one-way flow of information. So please, if you do have a question, come off, put your mic on and ask the question. I'm pretty sure that, another 20 people are sitting there hoping that somebody's going to ask the question that you're going to ask. So please take the time to ask questions here. So what is a forensics audit? Well, this is just what we're going to go through today. Forensics audits, what is the difference between a forensics audit and an external audit, the costs involved, the challenges that are faced, and the results of forensics audits, what actually happens at the end. So forensics audit is basically a very narrow, deep dive into certain areas of your financial statements. Because it is a deep dive, it is generally fairly expensive, so you don't want to do a really wide area. You want to do a very narrow dive into areas where there are problems. And you want to go through. So if you know that there's a bunch of contracts that have been signed where there's potential kickbacks, that's what you'd be looking at. And you'd be focusing just on that. You'd also generally have a look for low-hanging fruit. So what is easy to prove in order to start getting some money to flow back into the community so that these forensics audits don't cost a lot of money. Forensics audits are there when there's the potential that somebody has either done something wrong or there's a bunch of errors that are going on that could be fixed. So it might not be that somebody's being fraudulent, somebody might just be spending money without thinking about how it should be spent and following that, and there might be better ways of doing it. Forensics audits are just there, they're there to uncover these things, and in such a way that they can later be taken to court and to go through the court procedure. And so, if there's a contract that's wrong, if there's a backhander that's been given in the contract, all of that has to be detailed as to exactly how that came about. And as I said before, it's a very comprehensive way of doing an audit. It's not a normal financial audit. So the costs and what are the challenges to obtaining forensics audit? Well, the first is cost. Forensics audits are expensive. There's no doubt about it that you're not going to get away with spending $2,000 or $3,000 and getting a forensics audit done. It just isn't going to work. You've got to have access to information. So you need the whole thing about doing any type of forensics investigation is you need access to information. Now, I've done some background work for some of the First Nations that are on today. And for instance, Frog Lake has spent $100 million over the last 7 years on their housing. Now, I've also been to Frog Lake, and there's nowhere near $100 million worth of housing in Frog Lake. So that would be an area where there should be some investigation done as to where this money has actually been spent, how it has been spent, and if there is somebody who is taking money wrongly, they should be prosecuted. It's as simple as that. There's often no access to the financial information of the subsidiary companies. Now, the FTA Act says that you have to have audited financial statements, but that's of the banned company. So that is the main overriding account. You do not necessarily need to have all of the subs audited with a full external audit. They could be notice to reader that those have been prepared under, and that's a very different form of examination. There are a number of bans. Caitlin's come across 90%, saying 90% are actually going with the Act. probably because we've been asked to look at the dodgy bands. Our view is that there's a lot less because we're seeing a lot less, but we're probably seeing the 10% that aren't actually pushing out the information there. One of the problems with an external audit is there's no detail behind the numbers. So while external audits are really good for giving you an overall picture, they're not very good for giving you what the detail is in the numbers. As I said before, Frog Lake's a very good example. We spent $100 million on housing in Frog Lake, but we don't know where. We know that $100 million's been spent, but how has it been spent? Is it costs going into houses? Is it paying for people to run the housing department? What is actually making up that 100 million at the end of the day? And that we really don't have access to, nor do we have access to any of the contracts that are written. So you don't have an access to a contract to say we're going to create 4 baseball diamonds and it's going to cost $15 million. And you go, well, hang on a second, why would it cost so much? Those are the type of things that forensics audits would look at, and that's the information that you require in order to get there. Now, what is the difference between an external and internal audit? And here I'm going to throw out a question, and I was trying to get a poll going, but I can't, unfortunately. I don't know why. But you know, it would be just nice to hear from a few of you. Do you think that external audits pick up fraud? Anybody?
No.
No, they don't.
No, they don't. And there you are exactly right. Okay, so let's first of all tell you what an external audit actually is. An external audit is there to say that the balance sheet of the company is primarily correct. It's something that you can rely on. So if they say that you've got $20 million in the bank account, you might have $19 million in the bank account, you might have $21 million in the bank account, but it will be around about that $20 million range. So if you're to make a decision on the financial statements of the company or of the band, the financial statement would give you, would be able to say, yeah, the financial statements are about right. They're not right, they're approximately right. You can rely on what they give, what the results are in the financial statements. And that is all that a financial audit, an external audit actually does. It doesn't have a look at fraud. It doesn't have a look for things being spent incorrectly or badly. That it may pick up fraud, but as we're going to see just now, not so often. So they don't focus on detecting fraud. It's not what they do. There have been various court cases where the auditing industry states that they are not bloodhounds, but watchdogs. And various judges have commented that the watchdogs are often asleep. And that is one of the problems that we have, is that there's no real independence on whether these figures are correct and whether the money has actually been spent correctly. So as I said, all it does is gives focus, gives you comfort that the balance sheet can be relied on. However, a forensics audit is there to actually detect whether there's something going wrong. That's the entire object of a forensics audit, is to have a look to see, was there value for money in contracts? Was cash spent correctly? Is everything backed up that should have, you know, if I've spent $50,000 on a house, are there invoices making up that 50,000? Can I actually justify everything? On the other hand, we don't give an audit opinion. So we're not telling you that your entire financial statements are correct. We're telling you that a very small portion of your financial statements are either right or they're wrong. And that's really important for people to know. And they're designed as a deep dive. They're not a shallow. We're not testing 25 transactions to see that 19 of them are okay, and therefore we can rely on them. We're testing often 100% of the transactions. We're digging deeper into the transactions. We're not just accepting what is there on face value. So they're very, very different animals. Now, how do, sorry, yeah, carry on, Mike.
So, analysis from 750,000 for 300 million, there's 50,000 to parameters like multi 900,000, to the ceiling type thing, and then, just that's me there for me. And I have to make this for them.
Sorry, you were breaking up there, Mike. I couldn't really hear what you were saying, unfortunately.
Exactly what's up with this. It's so.
If you could put it into the chat, Mike, I'll read it out of the chat. Okay, so one of the main areas that fraud is found, believe it or not, and this is not just First Nations, this is in all companies, is that TIP actually finds the most fraud. One of the things that is really needed by the First Nations, in my opinion, is to have a whistleblowing hotline set up that people can report where they think fraud is taking place within their particular band. It would be really important to do because it's people who are on the inside who know what's going on, who actually are able to say, okay, we've got a problem with this contract. The chief is taking 10% of it or 20% of it. And the councillors are taking another 10% of that contract. And somebody inside knows that that is happening, but often won't report it because they're scared of actually reporting it. Internal audits pick up about 16%. The scary part is when you look at external audits, they pick up about 4% of all frauds that take place. I'm just going to repeat that. External audits pick up about 4% of all frauds that take place. So to rely on your external audit to pick up fraud is not the correct thing to do. In fact, by accident is 5%. So people stumbling across fraud, they actually pick up more than the external auditors. And these aren't my figures. This is the ACFE, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners in the States. And they publish this every 2 years. And ever since I've been a forensics accountant, they published it every 2 years. And every year, external audit does no better. And TIP is generally the highest by a long way. So if you're looking to improve your band, one of the things to do is to have a whistleblowing hotline which allows people to anonymously say where frauds are taking place. And that's really important, is that it's an anonymous way of reporting. The challenges faced in conducting First Nations audits are many. One of them is that there's a lot of sensitivities that arise during an investigation. The bands generally have 2 or 3 family groupings. And I know that's a generalization, but it's in the ones that we're looking at, they're small family groupings, which mean that if you're accusing somebody, they're related to a lot of people within the band. The chief and council are often involved in the fraud. This is probably the saddest part of these investigations, is that if chief and council are involved, it's really difficult to get information out. Again, I'll point to, we did a presentation to Chief and Counsel at Frog Lake. They agreed to do the forensics investigation, and a day later they came back and said there's no ways we're doing it. And they have stonewalled that investigation ever since. And this type of thing can be seen as a vendetta between two family groups. So one family group saying, no, I'm going to take you guys out because I want to get my own people in. And that's really, that again is a sad fact of how these investigations get derailed. The costs of a forensics audit, they are high. You're probably looking at $50,000 to start a decent forensics audit. So they are fairly high, and if you don't have specific details of where there are problems, if it's just a generalization problem, it's a lot more difficult to find out exactly what has happened. Who will pay for the forensics audit? Is it going to be band members? Is it going to be through the government? How is it actually going to be paid for? And one of the things is are we going to be able to get cooperation? I was talking to Caitlin before this, and she said one of the problems that we often face going into forensics audits is we get in when chief and counsel are turned over and a new chief comes in. And then when we go to have a look for records, we find that all the records have been destroyed. And that's one of the real problems to doing this. So there's a real need for cooperation and communication during a First Nations audit.
Dave?
Yeah.
I have three questions from the audience.
Yeah.
The first one is, I'll just ask the three questions, then you can answer them. What is fraud? If you can explain that in very easy to understand language. Secondly, is it common for, if you're going to have a forensic audit, that it be done by the same audit company that did the external audit for the First Nation? And thirdly, is there, what's the usual window of opportunity, or when should a forensic audit take place after it's been suspected of some financial wrongdoing?
Okay, so fraud is somebody who intentionally, there are 5 things which define fraud, but basically it is an intention to take money illegally for a purpose that it was not designed for. So for instance, let's say you have a contract and it's going to cost $1 million to build a rodeo ring or something like that. And I go along and I say to the guy who's going to build it, okay, instead of charging me $1 million, I want to charge you to charge me $1.5 million. And that 500,000 we're going to split between us. So you're going to give me 250 and you're going to take 250. And that basically would be a fraudulent transaction. It could be that somebody is handing out money to individuals and not putting them through the welfare department. And there's a whole lot of problems, because that could be seen as they're buying votes, or alternatively, when they submit their expenses, because it's just, I've handed out a $100 note. Did I hand out 100 or did I hand out 500? And so when they get back to submitting their expenses, what you'll generally find is instead of $100, it's gone through as 500. And the person who's handing out the money is making 400, and the person who's getting the money is making 1. And those are kind of examples of how fraud would work. So it's not just theft, it's actually hiding stuff away from, it's hiding things in order for them not to be shown. Sorry, Rob, what was the second question?
I have a question.
You okay, Chris?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm wondering, does fraud include the purchase of lands from the chief, buying reserve land?
It may. If it's an arm's length deal and it's for fair value, then no, there's no fraud there. If, however, he purchases some land from the band and gets it at a significant discount, then that's fraudulent.
And does that include CP land as well?
That would include any land. If he either sells land to the band, which is overvalued. So we've had an instance where a casino was going to be built on non-tribal land. The land was bought by chief and council or members of chief and council and then sold on to the band. So the land was bought for about $100,000 and was sold on to the band for $1 million. And that was just a very simple fraudulent transaction. The dates in between it being transferred were less than 3 months. So it was bought and sold on within a 3-month period. And yet it was sold on for 10 times the amount that it was originally purchased for. And because it was chief and council who were doing that, that was definitely a fraudulent action.
Okay, you mentioned something about contracts aren't included in the audit.
No, the contracts are, but they're not looked at for a fraudulent purpose.
I'll give you an example of why I'm asking. Does a contract include, like if they put a business on the reserve, for example, like that plant, recycle plant, and they also put a weed place? But is that considered contract or?
Yes, that would be a contract, but that would probably, it may well not even fall into part of the audit. The auditors may have a look at that contract to see that if the contract said that they were to pay $100,000 for using the land, that the $100,000 is what was paid. If the contract is fraudulent in nature because it shouldn't have been 100, it should have been 300,000 that was being charged, and that money is being split, then the audit probably would not find that out because that's not what they're looking for. They're not delving into the contracts.
There's also, in the past year, a man they put up for the pipeline workers.
Sorry, I missed you there. In the past year?
Camp for pipeline workers. Is that included in the audit?
Again, I can't say what the audit would have looked at, but the audit would have probably looked to see that what was in the contract was what actually took place, not what is behind the contract. And this is the subtle difference between an audit and a forensics audit. As a forensics audit will look to see that the contract makes sense, whereas the external audit will have a look to see that a contract is in place and that it has been correctly accounted for.
Thank you.
Rob, you had 2 other questions?
I was going to question about the professional bookkeeper. If you go to court, does the judge prefer a report from a professional bookkeeper?
Oh, and you're asking?
Again, it depends what you're looking at. So if you're looking at a forensics audit, a bookkeeper may be able to give the details that are required, but forensics audits are really fairly specialized in what they're looking at and how they're looking at it. It's not what is happening in the numbers, but what the story of the numbers is. That's really what's important, is it's the story behind the numbers. Okay, so some of the things which are problematic at the moment is that the First Nations have recently been granted a lot of money in terms of various settlements that have come out. The Cows and Plows settlement has, for instance, just come out. And yet we've still got a bunch of communities which are living in poverty. So there definitely is a disconnect at some point. And there are expenses being made in various bands that are not, they're not of the, they don't add up to what is on the ground. So, you know, if you're moving water and it's costing $500,000 a month to move water into a band, is that reasonable? And that's one of the things that needs to be checked. So one of the things that you don't want in a band is for people to think that there's a problem when there isn't a problem. So it's very easy to think that, well, we should be doing better, but the costs have just gone up through inflation and naturally are now more expensive. So it's also important from a chief and council side to have a look at this and to say that a forensics audit might help them if there's, you know, murmurs in a band that a couple of contracts are incorrect or something like that. It would actually help chief and council to do a forensics audit in order to show that there is no problem with those contracts. So it can work both ways. And the biggest thing here is to preserve the financial integrity of the band. So a few things to remember. Fraud is designed to be concealed. It's not there in the open. It's not something that your bookkeeper is going to have a look at and say, oh, what, account 101, this is what has been stolen. It's not going to happen like that. It's going to be hidden away from the general viewpoint. So it's, the most likely way is going to be through backhanders being paid or by invoices being generated which are false. And those are really going to be the primary ways that money is taken out of a band. There are essential components and methodologies involved in conducting a forensics audit. So one of those is we'll have a look at as much information as we can get. And we'll have a look for things like round payments, for duplicate amounts going through. We'll have a look for the cost value of something and compare it to what has happened or what the cost of a particular project should be. Quite often in our data analytics, when we find a problem, we'll then have to go further. And Caitlin was talking earlier about, well, you know, just because you've got the information doesn't mean the end of you running off to court. And it certainly doesn't, because if I see a contract for building a rodeo stadium, which is $15 million, and I go and get quotes for it, and it says, no, that should have cost $3 million to build, I'm then going to have to go to the company who was involved in building that and get their records on how they were paid and what their expenses were in actually putting that contract together. So, and it will often mean us actually going into those companies and doing further work there. So to be able to prove that money was paid back to somebody who happened to be involved in setting up that particular contract.
And how far back can a forensic audit go?
So there's no statute on fraud. So it can go back as far as to day one. However, that's not practical. Generally speaking, the banks will only have information for the last 7 years. And that really is one of your primary criteria to doing a forensics audit is bank statements. So anything which is over 7 years old, you're starting to look at problems in doing a forensics audit. Because once it's gone past the 7-year period, you can't go to the bank and say, oh, I'm missing these bank statements, could you please give them to me? Because they simply will not give you any information older than 7 years. Okay, so steps involved in planning and executing a forensics audit in a First Nation community. The first is you've got to get chief and council to buy in, because you need to get into the information in the First Nation. Now that might take a court order to get them to buy in, but that's really what you need. Hire a firm that's capable of dealing with the audit, which is independent from the band or bands in the surrounding areas. So you don't want to hire somebody who's doing the external audit for the band next door in order to do your forensics audit. There was a question that came up earlier. Can we use the same accountants to do our forensics audit as we use to do our external audit? And I would strongly, strongly recommend against doing that. There's a couple of really good reasons. The first is that depending on what the fraud is, should it have been picked up by your friends, by your external auditors? While external auditors don't look for fraud, if something is glaringly obvious that it was fraudulent in nature, there may be a chance that you can go to your external auditors and sue them in order to get your funds back. So if you're hiring your external auditors as your forensics auditor, they're not going to say, go sue ourselves. That's just never going to happen. So no, don't hire from the same firm. Appoint a team independent of CNC to oversee the forensics audit. So there's a couple of things that you've got to be careful of with a forensics audit. One is that the costs can get out of hand pretty quickly. So you need to keep control over that. So you need a team of 3 people who are independent, who are going to report back to chief and council and report back to the band as to this is the amount that's been spent, and this is what the projections are going forward, and this is what we found so far. And they are the ones who are responsible for keeping the financial audit going, or the forensics audit going or not going at the end of the day. And they provide a really, really important overview into doing a forensics audit. There's nothing worse than somebody coming in and doing an audit, and 6 months later and $500,000 later, they walk away and say, sorry, we haven't found anything. I mean, that would just be an absolute travesty. So you need to make sure that these audits are staged, that you do a certain amount, and if nothing's uncovered at the end of that first period, maybe it's time to call it a day. Maybe it's not the right thing to pursue it any further. And, you know, so that's really important. And then always monitor costs versus benefits. If you're going to spend more money on a forensics audit than what you're going to get back, there's no point in conducting a forensics audit. So if you think that chief and council have stolen $1,000, guys, write it off to experience. It's not going to help you to do a forensics audit. You need to be doing a forensics audit where you believe that $1 million has gone missing or $500,000 has gone missing. That's the type of thing that would encourage you to do a forensics audit, not for petty cash. You really do need to say, we're going to spend $50,000 on a first stage of an audit. If we're not looking at getting $500,000 back, at the end of that first stage, we shouldn't really be doing it. And it's really, really important that people don't go into forensics audits for frivolous types of things. If they think that somebody's got a backhander of a couple of $1,000, fire the person, vote them out in the next election. Don't do a forensics audit. But if you think that he's stolen $1 million, yeah, it's probably a good thing to do a forensics audit. And always make sure that everything in a forensics audit is transparent. So it's transparent to chief and counsel and to the band exactly what the findings are of those auditors. Okay, there have been some really successful cases that have come about from doing forensics audits. There's been a couple of chiefs that have been locked away because of a forensics audit, and that's not a bad thing. Guys, at the end of the day, if a small number of people steal money, they can take down a large community. So really, at the end of the day, it's so important to have financial transparency. And if you ask questions, if you see, for instance, with, again, I'm going to use Frog Lake because $100 million at Frog Lake just really burns me. But if you have a look at that $100 million that they've spent on housing in Frog Lake, HODS should be able to go and say to the chief and counsel there, guys, give me details of what we spent that $100 million on. And he should be able to get that. That is the whole point. There should be financial transparency. So recommendations and best practices for implementing a forensics audit in the First Nation. Probably the easiest one is going to be to set up a new chief and counsel. It's very sad, but very true. You need, the easiest way to run a successful forensics audit is not running to court to get the information to start with. The easiest way is for chief and counsel to buy in. The easiest way for chief and counsel to buy in is if it's a new chief and counsel who want to sweep, who are the new broom who wants to sweep everything clean. That really is the best way of getting a forensics audit going. There are other ways, as Caitlin said, that we can get forensics audits going, and that's going through the court procedure and going through the asking for information. But as I've shown, you know, getting the financial statements is not the be-all and end-all to prove fraud. In fact, you cannot prove fraud from financial statements. You can prove that there are problems, but you cannot prove fraud. So you need the detail behind that in order to in order to be able to see fraud. BMAAAC, I would really encourage you to set up a whistleblowing hotline where complaints can come in that can then be looked at and, you know, handed to people like Caitlin, like myself, like other people in the industry, who would be able to then have a look and say, okay, these are really good allegations, we can work with these. Remember that slide I put up earlier that said that 41% or 42% of all frauds are found by tip. If you're not utilizing that, you really are missing a trick. And it's by far the best way of getting good information that will allow you to have a targeted investigation at the end of the day. So,
thank you, Dave. There was somebody that said to ask if you can just repeat that succinctly as you can.
Oh, gee, there's some nice long ones here. Sorry, just going back a slide quickly here. Oops, I'm going back.